Guy. Thank you, Mickey. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be back. So I think I spoke to AIA Florida in 2005 and then in 2010. And then Mickey got the restraining order lifted, so I'm back for this one. And I've got about an hour in which to explain the future, which means I'm going to leave out some of the details. Let's begin. Three main topics. I'm going to talk about automation and the question of what can you do that should not be automated. There's stuff that can't be automated, and there's stuff that shouldn't be automated. Curiosity. And the key question, this is probably the most important question for you to take with you and talk about with your friends, with your family, and even those internal dialogues of not what do you need to be curious about, but what else do you need to be curious about? Because there's so many things that are going to be connected that we didn't expect. And then you brought up the topic of liminality. And the question I want to know is what's really between now and then? And the slides will be available. And there's more words on the slides than would be sort of typical, but it is so that you can get the copy of the slides and talk about them and think about them and explore some of the topics and resources that I provide with that. All right, we're going to start with automation and this marvelous quote from Mitch Ratliff, who said, "A computer lets you make more mistakes faster than any invention in human history, with the possible exception of handguns and tequila." And the robot is courtesy of ChatGPT, the Mid-Journey app, where you just put in the prompts and you keep playing with it until you come up with a drunk robot. I know what you're thinking. Should you trust futurists? I knew you were going to ask that. Here's the thing. When you hear a forecast about the future, where somebody says, this is going to be big and you really have to get into it, ask, is there a profit motive behind the profit motive? If we go along with them, if we do what they say and support it and engage and buy it, do they get rich? Do they gain power? As in, what's really going on? And then another thing about forecasts is that we tend to overestimate what we can do in 1 year and then underestimate what we do in 5 years. So you'll see the new stuff come out with all sorts of publicity, and then inevitably we watch a lot of that crash and burn. And of course there are people, entrepreneurs, a little bit back behind the scenes watching and going, okay, they could have done this or they should have done that. And they come back. And so lots of the failed futures come back as success years later. And there's always this idea of what comes after, what comes next. We are really good, particularly in this society, of going, if this, then that, end of conversation. Well, no, the conversations never stop. So what else happens? What are the implications of the implications of the implications? Thinking 3 levels in, 3 levels forward. For instance, you probably have seen the Google car. This came out, I think, in like 2012 or something like that, and it was, going to be the future, self-driving cars. And maybe, but there are 4 things that are really fun. One, or sort of true about the predictions. If we have a self-driving car, like the Google car, number 1, you will be safer. Number 2, you will be more efficient. And number 3, you will be celibate. Nobody's getting lucky in that thing, are they? And the 4th thing, which is probably the most fascinating one, is the head of engineering. So there was this incident where a Google car came up to a 4-way stop. And you know how have you ever come to a 4-way stop? And then of course, and quite often you do a visual, and sometimes there's a nod, whatever, so somebody goes first. Well, the Google car couldn't get past that. And it was stuck there. It had to reboot the car before it would move, because it was always waiting for its turn, but it didn't know how to identify that. And the lead engineer said, This would work if people were less idiotic. Good luck with that. What's going on with the screen? Yeah. I know what you're thinking. If he was a futurist, wouldn't he have known that was going to happen? All right. Picture, if you will. It's the idea that this next slide is trust needs more than numbers. And how many of you saw the movie Moneyball? Okay, and that idea, there was an article in the Atlantic magazine that was entitled Moneyball for Everything. And it was that we were learning to colonize the world and life with mathematics. Yeah, it's showing up here. Okay. Seems to be working. Well, when I hit backwards, my slides move. The gods are angry. Thank you. Wait, suddenly all my slides no longer make any criticism of AI. That's weird. But the idea that AI, or the algorithms, that we can solve the problems of the world through math. And the idea is with measurement, you increase predictability. And that's kind of what we want. We want a more predictable world. But if I point at any one of you individuals and say, you're pretty predictable, that's not a compliment. And what if we get to a point in the world where we're too predictable, too measured, too monitored? Peter Drucker, sort of the management guru, if you were old enough to remember this guy, he said if you can measure it, you can manage it. Which if you take that into 2023, if you can measure it, you can automate it. Think about all the aspects of your work as architects and engineers. Because I know there was at least one engineer in the crowd. Heard him earlier. And he had to point that out, didn't he? What can't be measured? How much is measurable? How much is immeasurable? And which is easier to make more predictable? Architecture or people? Because we know about the concept of nudging to get more predictable behavior out of people, in the way that Google will, the algorithms follow you, and then when you do a search, it sort of is customized around to you. And it was even found to have been used in the election in terms of, like, certain things didn't come up in your searches based upon your political predilections. And so I want to present to you an idea called the Turing paradox. So the Turing test is where they designed this computer. You had a conversation with the computer. And you would say, well, I'm not feeling well. Really? Why are you not feeling well? Oh, I've just got some problems with my dad. Tell me about your family. And so it goes back and forth. And the idea is that a computer will pass the Turing test when you can't tell that you're having a conversation with a computer. And and Alan Turing came up with this. Originally, it was called the imitation game. That's what he called it. That's the name of the movie. That as the machines get better and better at passing the Turing test, will people put less effort into passing it themselves? As it would let the machines take more and more of our tasks and more of our responsibilities, and we go for that quicker, cheaper, easier bottom line, and forget about the horizon of where else can this take us? So there's a term called algorithmic governance, where more and more decisions are being put into the computers, the systems that run our lives, that we like and we let, and that big organizations push. But is there transparency? It's like Jeremy talked about. Transparency in decision making is sometimes very difficult, but it's very, very important. And sometimes you have to break through that fourth wall to help people understand, here's why we're making this decision. But if that goes away, what happens to the sense of a democratic society? And do we trade all of this? Do we go with rigid rules versus individual discretion? Because we're failed and fallen creatures. We are imperfect and imperfectible. And so therefore we have to rely on each other. We have to build upon things like trust and learning to build trust across boundaries so that we still remain human and the machines serve us and not the other way around. Erich Fromm wrote a book in the 1950s called Escape from Freedom. It was post-World War II, and he was looking back at why did so many people give up their freedom to these dictatorships? And in part, because it just became easier. What will you do when the machines ask for more and more authority? How will you make decisions? When thinking about automation, think about what's called Pareto's Law, the 80-20 notion. 80% of the wealth is controlled by 20% of the people. 80% of the problems are caused by 20% of the people. In the future with automation, 80% of what you do is going to be better done by a machine or someone with lower skills and lower pay. You want to survive? You want to thrive? You've got to figure out what's that 20%. And how do you expand that to fill the gap left by the machines taking more and more of the measurable tasks? And you all have algorithms. The algorithms follow you individually around, helping you, but also guiding you and pushing you. How powerful are they? How many of you have a smartphone? How many of you are looking at it right now? Think about our relationship to these things. We gaze at them. We talk to them. We listen to them. We stroke them. There's just two words missing to explain this all. My precious. Our behavior with these things is indistinguishable from either an addiction or much, much worse, worship. These make really bad gods. And to quote Audrey Hepburn in the movie Funny Face, how long has this been going on? When you think about architecture, and who was it yesterday in the governance meeting that quoted somebody else saying that BIM was from the devil? This is a field that has constantly been engaging and embracing technology and changing the way you relate and also what your work is. The 20% includes things like bigger picture, metaphors, analogies, paradox, as in machines don't know how to do this. AI doesn't know how to do these things. They can fake it, but it's not real. Multiple point perspectives and open-ended real-world problems. If that sounds like some of you, then maybe you have a future here. And there's something called centaurs. But I have to ask, I'm sure you've wondered this, can architects be automated? Well, I hear these immediate no's. That's not the complete answer. The answer is no, not the good ones. And how you define what is a good architect in the coming years will greatly determine what this organization is and can do for the world. So Big Blue, that beat Kasparov in chess, so now computers can beat any human in chess. But a centaur is where a human uses a computer to play against a computer, and they win every time. See, we are tool makers. We use tools. We've always done that. Homo faber, we are tool makers. But we have to use the technologies to support us, to back us up, and not necessarily run interference, particularly in terms of the relationships. Kevin Kelly, the guy that was the first editor of Wired magazine, he said it is not a race against the machine. It is, and it always has been, a race with the machine. Part B, curiosity. Steve Jobs said, creativity is just about connecting the dots. A lot of people don't have very diverse experiences, so there aren't enough dots to connect. So we're going to talk about dots. We're going to talk about creativity and curiosity. This is a self-portrait from second grade. Now here's the thing. Think about how your future started. I am one of 5 boys in my family, and I was number 4. I was the baby of the family for 8 years until my parents slipped up and had Mike. Mike the Mistake, as we would call him sometimes. So I'm looking around for photographs of me as a child, and there really aren't very many of them because I was the spare to the spare to the spare. There's all sorts of photographs of Jim and Rick, and a few of John. By the time we got to Dave, it was like, yeah, whatever, we've seen it before. But I did find this self-portrait from second grade. I'm rather proud of it. I did have braces during the pandemic, so my teeth are a little bit better than that. And apparently the hair is a little different. This is my second grade report card. Let's take a look at this. So, language, DFF. My best subject was art. I got all C's. They saw potential here clearly. On the character development side, practices self-control, 3 checks. Respects authority, 2 checks. Mickey learned about that when I was on the board with him. Completes work on time. Check, 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 double check. So if you think we're going to end at noon, you're... And notice on penmanship, there are these 2 smeared, oh, come on. Oh, thank you. I think I need not to move around a little bit. You can see those are smeared. You know those are probably my mom's tears. Here's the best part about the whole report card. At the very bottom, it says a circle around a letter means the child is capable of better work. How many circles do you see? There are 2 of them. Yeah, so, great future ahead of me. And how many of you are like me, where my mom repeatedly reminded me that when, at parent-teacher conference, teacher said several times, his head is filled with cobwebs, yes. So let's go there. And that's what your brain basically is. When you're a child, when you're under 5, when you're growing up, you have an empty head, but it's filled with cobwebs, and your brain comes with one instruction: ask questions. And there is a marvelous book called Curious by Ian Leslie, in which talks about diversive curiosity. That's where you're just trying to figure out what's going on in the world. How do I learn how the world works and reduce uncertainty? And then epistemic curiosity is when you start to figure it out, then you start drilling down, drilling deep into the things that you really like. And I always bring a few copies of books to give away. And it seems that there is a birthday girl in the audience here. Shadia, you get a copy of Curiosity. And the best part is, we met early when you just arrived, and we were going through the buttons, and she goes, oh, here's one on Curiosity. I love Curiosity. So it's the perfect birthday present, isn't it? So in that book, they talked about that every child between 3 and 5 asks like 40,000 questions. How many of you have ever had children? Does that number sound suspiciously low? And there's a great program on Apple TV called Becoming You, in which they follow kids the first 2,000 days of their lives. In one episode, they're following these two little Moppets, they're twins, with their mom walking through New York City, and the kids are asking about the birds in the trees. Why is that bird up there? Because its nest is up there. Why? And they clocked these two kids. It was 90 questions an hour, which sounds exhausting, but yet at the same time, that's the purpose, and that's the relationship that parents have, is to help them understand the world. They also note in that book that the average child falls down 10,000 times before they learn to walk. What other example in your life have you had that much commitment of constant failure to eventual success? See, they also note that children very quickly figure out whether or not you're an idiot based upon the quality of your answers. And if they think you're an idiot, they stop asking you questions. But then, here's a weird thing. So like my dad, maybe your dad or mom, they would answer questions, they would give you the wrong answers. My dad was constantly giving us the wrong answers because, but it was a joke, and it also is how you learn to sort of play with knowledge and curiosity, to take an answer and go, oh, he means the opposite or something like that. Just fascinating work. And again, the question is, and so here's what happens when you ask questions. The cobweb catches answers. You ask more questions. You get more answers. But then the brain, wait. Okay, now we got to go through this again here. Pattern recognition. The brain organizes. This is cool stuff. What else needs your curiosity? Because when it comes to the future, you're all children. And you have to learn more. So you have to collect more dots. So in 2016, I worked with the Vinyl Institute and did a talk and then moderated a panel with these three people, 2 architects, one does more installation stuff, and then Jonathan Thayer, who is an industrial designer. And these were the topics of conversation in that workshop. Why do we design the way we do? Billy Faircloth, I think she's with Kieran Timberlake, she has a video, a TEDx video on YouTube on what we don't know about 2x4s. Which, of course, the first thing is they're not 2x4. But she gets into the molecular structure of wood, which she said then turns it into, when you start understanding the molecular structure and how you can manipulate that, it becomes an emerging material. But there was all these other things like, why don't industries and organizations cross-collaborate anymore? And what we found out is the Vinyl Institute did that, and then somewhere in the late 60s, there was a lawsuit, and it shut it all down. How many of you in this room have anything to do with architecture? Who's not here? Who's not here that may have a greater impact on the future of this industry than the people sitting here? And so what do your materials want to be? So this is my brother Mike the Mistake. And He was a four-time college dropout. And he became a jeweler. He apprenticed to a goldsmith and gemologist in Italy, started a jewelry shop, had a successful business, got married, went through a horrible divorce, sold the business, went back to college, and graduated first in his class in chemistry, and then went on to UC Irvine and got a PhD. And while he was in grad school, his work made the cover of Science magazine because he figured out how to grow wires at a molecular level on the side strata of graphite. How many of you had to wait to the middle of adulthood to figure out that your brother was probably adopted? But I asked Mike, tell me about the future of materials and nanotechnology. He goes, they throw billions of dollars using brute force to make things nano. We do it by watching nature self-assemble structures and learn to coax individual atoms and ions. Nature doesn't have multi-million-dollar fabrication facilities, yet it beats our engineers by 5 orders of magnitude in size and an infinite order of magnitude in cost for self-assembly in biology and material sciences. To make nano cheaply, we only need to find conditions that nature wants to make things. Every biological cell is proof of that. Combine structural patterning elegance in biology with the material deposition finesse found in geological mineralization processes, and we have more than everything we need for 1,000,000 times less energy. This is also why we don't invite him to dinner anymore. Well, he's obviously brilliant, and he now works at the National Lab in Kentucky, Oak Ridge National Labs, and doing amazing stuff. But the questions it raises, will we grow buildings? So you got the biomimicry arena. But what if we can grow buildings? And then you go, well, probably not. And then the question is, if not, then what would have to change so we could grow them? And we certainly can grow materials. And there was recently an article I saw that somebody sent me. It was about learning to grow wood from chemicals without the tree. What will define the term architect, the boundaries, in 2033? 10 years from now, 2033. How many are still planning on being alive in 2033? How many are going to wait and find out how the talk ends? Who gets to decide those boundaries? When and where? Part C, liminality. So, fascinating term, didn't know it, started researching it. Liminal is from the Latin word limen, which means threshold. A liminal space is the time, I like that, the space is the time, so there's a time-space continuum going on here, between what was and next. It's a place of transition, a time of waiting and not knowing the future. And as you will learn in the presentation tomorrow I'm doing on presentation development, I wander around my house while I'm crafting these things. I'll do something and I'll wander around. And I was walking down a hallway and I had this picture there that I'd found in an antique store. And it's from like the 1910s, 1920s. It's clearly hand-colored. And it's these 2 women in Japan, and they're at a threshold. There's a liminal. What I love is they're both bowing. And are they bowing to the threshold? Are they bowing to each other? And then, how many of you have ever read Junichiro Tanazaki's In Praise of Shadows? It's a marvelous little essay that architects introduced me to. And very, very soon in the book, he goes, our forebears, making poetry of everything in life. And he was talking about bathrooms, which he says, in the West, we like to hide them and almost deny their existence. And they're a place of beauty and contemplation. And his great line of, were it not for shadows, there would be no beauty. So let's think about that as we go through this section here. And this is how we look at time, that there are liminals between the past and the present, and between now and the future, but sort of this rough division. And never the twain shall they meet. Here's another way of thinking about it. We go from the momentary into the temporal to the eternal. Momentary. Think of spices. Those little things that just sort of give delight. And then you think back on your life. What is most memorable? Quite often, it's those moments in which time goes away. But if we're dealing with past, present, and future, that's left behind. But there's not a liminal sense to that because we recall those, and sometimes those are the most marvelous parts of our lives. Temporal is liminal because it's about time, it's about transition, it's about change. But then we go into things like the eternal, like the concept of justice, where they transcend time. And we don't invent it, it exists. We recognize it or not, or we fail to live up to it. But this might be another way of thinking about, is there really liminality in all that sense of time? And then I was speaking to AIA Kansas, and afterwards a young man came up. It was right before lunch. He goes, "Can I sit with you at lunch?" "Yes." So we're sitting there, and he's explaining that he's a member of one of the tribes there and part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And you may have heard that idea that in the Iroquois Confederacy, they consider decisions unto the seventh generation. So he said, I was talking with some of our elders about that. And one of them shook his head and said, "You don't get it. You think it's about you and all the things that you're going to do to make this great future." I said, "No, you're in the middle. 7 generations, but 3 generations back and 3 generations forward. We have what's called the egotism of time, temporal arrogance, that we are somehow at the pinnacle." And I remember my freshman year of college, my parents took me and Mike, we went to Mexico for 2 weeks, and we were at Mitla. And my dad pointed out that there's brickwork there that we don't know how to do. And all these things that are lost, that's just one tiny example, but all these things that are lost because we have forgotten or we destroyed through wars and what have you. So this, there's liminal, which is about transition, but then there's also paradoxical, which I think is just as important, if not more important, because architecture in particular is a field that constantly deals with paradox, form and function. So you can look at some buildings and you go, well, no, they just chose one and went with that. Art and science, light and shadow, head, hand, female and male, change and tradition. And change is an interesting one because how many of you want to be change agents? How many want to be agents of tradition? A few hands go up. But what? No, tradition is bad. No. G.K. Chesterton was an English writer, died in 1936. He said the tradition was the democracy of the dead. It is giving the vote to the most obscure class of people of all, our ancestors. And just as you would not deny somebody the vote because they're going to serve you lunch in a few minutes, you would not deny the vote to someone just because they're your grandparents. What do we hold on to? What do we let go of? Is a powerfully important question to ask about what we do in the here and now. Bottom line horizon, measurable and immeasurable, now and then. And when I say the word then, I'm being vague as to when that then was. Some ideas about how you find that 20%. 3, I think, wonderful quotations. Juhani Palasma wrote The Thinking Hand. He's a Finnish architect. He said, the use of the computer has broken the sensual and tactile connection between imagination and the object of design. Alain de Botton, in The Architecture of Happiness, said, the creation of beauty, once viewed as the central task of the architect, has quietly evaporated from serious professional discussion and retreated to a confused private imperative. Sir Roger Scruton, there is a deep human need for beauty, and if you ignore that need in architecture, your buildings will not last. So my last talk was to SEBEC, Seattle Building Enclosure Council, and the conference was on future-proofing. And I spent a week out in Seattle wandering around and took a lot of photos. It had been 10 years since I'd been there, and there was a lot of new towers. And I really couldn't tell the difference between the towers. This one I think is a little older, but it reminds me of this marvelous quotation from Melissa Pierce, who said, so many buildings look cold and unromantic, boxy without curves. I'm starting to believe the architects had mothers that never loved them. Because maybe it does have to do with love. This one's fun. So when I was on the board, I was one of the liaisons to AIAS. And I got to keynote be one of the keynoters there 4 years in a row. Twice because I was there just to help coach the candidates. And then somehow I managed to get somebody's flight delayed or reservation canceled. So I got to speak 4 times. And in 2012, there was this report in the Daily Beast that said, architecture is the worst possible career to go into. They were saying, what a horror. Mickey, you remember that? And it was big discussion on the board. And so I surveyed AIS students and asked, if you don't become an architect, what else might you do? Got their answers and then took all of them and put them into Wordle.net that creates word clouds, takes out the articles, and then the more the word shows up in the answer, the bigger the word is. So those are all the words in the answers. Anything jump out at you there on that cloud? And here's the lesson I took from that, is they understand that there are not really genuine divisions in all of that work. And we structure it in order to help us organize and make sense of the world. But in reality, there aren't boundaries between all these occupations, and that may be in terms of how you deal with finding the 20%, is you start blurring the boundaries and reach out. And Kimberly had talked about the people that don't become architects, and there was that thing about the missing 33% or something like that. And I raised the question, who says they're missing? You say they're missing. They may know where they are and be having a great life. And Maya Small is an architect out in San Francisco, and she had created back then a Tumblr account called Architects of Other Things. And I helped her with it and put together this marvelous list of all these people who had gone out and done other things. They had trained as an architect. Miss World had trained as an architect, but my favorite one, Weird Al Yankovic. Yeah, and you know that some of his thinking informs how he structures music. And what's the line? That architecture is frozen music? So many of you saw the buttons out there. And this was my anti-isolation pandemic project. Because, we're all locked down, and then the media is taking advantage of this and making everybody mad. And so I had a friend of mine owns the factory that makes these buttons. And so how much does a button maker cost? $225. How much are the parts? $2,500 for $110. So I started making buttons. And then I would put magnets on them, and I just started putting them around the community. And I would put them at coffee shops. I would leave them on ledges. I've made over 4,500 of them so far. And I just leave them everywhere because the idea is to get people talking. And there's a ballpark near my house in Milwaukee. And I was putting magnets on there, and there was like 40 magnets. And my physical therapist said, my niece and I found those. And we talked about each one as we went along. And I would also find them moved. Like people would move them so that the same author was on the same pole. But it was just this interaction. And you know that young people love buttons. So what I want you to do is, here's some of the buttons I made. So Edward Galeano said, we are all mortal until the first kiss and the second glass of wine. Talk about liminal. Lily Tomlin said, we developed language because of our deep need to complain. Here's one good for our conference here. In the end, we all become stories. Rosa Parks said, I had no idea that history was being made. I was just tired of giving up. And G.K. Chesterton said, poets have been mysteriously silent on the subject of cheese. So what I want you to do, I made over 500 buttons for the conference. They're at the front desk. I want you to go and get some. And don't look to find one. Just go in and take a couple. And then when you look at them, if it doesn't appeal to you, think about somebody that you could give it to, or to put it on their desk or put it on the bulletin board, because it's all about trying to create conversations. James Baldwin, the writer, said, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. It's about conversations. It's about honoring the other and listening as if you were wrong and wanted to know why. It's crossing that liminal. All right, we have to wrap this up. I have 3 key points to make here. I have some advice that you can apply as soon as you walk out the door. These are the critical conclusions to the presentation on how to find clarity and connection. Ready? Number 1, start smoking. What do smokers do that other people don't? They take breaks. And while they're taking a break, what are you doing? Working. Hey, come here. Listen, work is overrated. It's good for the soul, but it's not the only thing good for our souls. Smokers take breaks and they talk to strangers because they are the most reviled minority group out there. We hate smokers and we are proud of our hatred of smokers. So when they see each other, they know that not only do they have a friend, they also have matches. Leo Tolstoy said, all great literature is one of 2 stories. A man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. And strangers are gateways to curiosity, the liminal. Because strangers know things you don't. And so if you reach out, if you see someone with a button, or you want to show, this is a way to increase those conversations. Because if you were to look around the room, you know there are people that you don't know. But if you make eye contact with somebody around during the convention, or you have a conversation, you get to change each other's lives forever for the better. Find those people, have those conversations. All right, so if number 1 is to start smoking, what's number 2? Dan Riley, start drinking? Really? Former AIA Florida president, member of the Strategic Council? Well, that's where you learn about drinking, I think. No, it's not start drinking, it's... Oh, wait, it is start drinking. You're a futurist, you didn't know it. Hey, the Kentucky Fried Research Foundation, there actually is one, they did a study and they found the average American spends less than 15 minutes having lunch. So, most of you are average Americans. Where do you have lunch? At your desk. With whom? My precious. I've missed you so much, even though I've never left you. When you break bread, you break barriers. And as you clearly can tell from this presentation, you know the presentations are not the important part of the conference. It's the conversations. And I want you to get drunk. As in this book, Drunk, by Edward Slingerland, which Dan won. So it's like the guy is English, who has this very great dry sense of English humor where you're reading along this scholarly thing and all of a sudden you burst out laughing because it's like, what's going on here? So the essence of it, he does talk about the dangers, which there clearly are. But there's also this, he talks about in your brain, there's Apollo, which is, sort of the prefrontal cortex that makes all the decisions, wants order, structure. And Dionysus, which basically wants to have a good time, be social, have fun, be engaged in life. Apollo hates Dionysus. Dionysus couldn't care less. And, it's like there is this sense of verses, but it is and. That this is both. This is we are odd creatures, and we have this diversity within our own selves. There are measurables and immeasurables. And there are metrics and poetics. We know how to do the metrics, but I want to see more poetic buildings. And I want you to design a time frame. So it's the idea of you take a photograph of yourself or someone you love, and with that person is somebody from the past you love, respect, and always want to have with you. This example is of my niece, Rachel, who was about 1 year old, and her great-grandma, Grandma Myrtle, who was like 99. And so you see this, distance and separation, obviously no distance and no separation, that sometimes the most important way to look at the future is when you hold it in your arms. Children are the message we send to the future. What are we saying? And this is kind of cool. These are those two women at age 21. And you can see there's a resemblance. And there's a continuity there. So you want to see my time frame, the one that really kind of expresses who I am? Remember, it's a picture of you as a little kid, smiling. And if there are no photographs of you as a child smiling, there's Photoshop. And then a picture of someone from your past you love, respect, and always want to have with you. Here's a picture of me as a little kid. It's extremely difficult to think of yourself as having anything important to say when you know you dress up in a bunny suit and you really like dressing up in a bunny suit. But for your sake, I hope you have a photograph of you like that. Being playful, being curious, loving to learn. I learned about play and curiosity from my grandfather. Want to see a picture of my grandfather? This is a picture of my grandfather wearing a bowling ball bag at my brother's wedding reception. Welcome to my family. There's a couple things I need you to know about my grandfather. Number one, he did not drink. Number two, he did not wear the bowling ball bag most of the time. Number three, he had several patents to his name for tools he made for the automobile industry. He was an auto mechanic who only went to 8th grade. And my mom would tell us he was the smartest man we would ever meet. And my dad would be sitting in the same room. And my dad was pretty smart. The fourth thing is, I miss him. The past goes away. And yet, is that entirely true? How many of you thought of somebody from your past that you would put in your time frame? How many of you thought of somebody from the past that you would put there? Are those people still there? Are those people still here? Are they still here? See, that's the thing. The frame goes away, and so we have to make a frame. But you hold on to certain things. You try to remember. We all become stories, and so you tell the stories, and you learn from them, and they integrate into who you are. And part of it becomes you. Where do you think I got this sense of humor? This is how we do it. This is how we bridge those gaps, by understanding that sometimes there are no gaps. We just have to look and see who we really are and what we can become. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't have any time for questions. I'll finish them up. Well, David, thank you so much. That was, as always, interesting. And mind you, David sat on the board when I was AIA National President, so the word interesting came up a lot in the conversations he started in the boardroom. But I want to thank you for being here. We're out of time, so we won't have any time for questions.
But I'm here for the whole, till Sunday morning, so would love to chat.
So you will see him out there, so grab a cigarette and a drink, and he'll be happy to talk to you. So thank you again, David. Thanks, everyone.